Can we talk about regrets? So many years ago, I was invited to go speak at a youth winter retreat up in northern Michigan. So on Friday, we loaded the kids up in the minivan and we got on the road for what's normally a 4-hour trip. But it was starting to snow, and we knew a big snowstorm was coming in, so we anticipated it would take a little bit longer. As we drove along, we realized we weren't going to make it to camp in time for dinner, so we probably needed to find a place along the way to eat. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to northern Michigan, but there's this line in Michigan that our family calls the fashion line, because north of there, everybody only wears flannel. And there's also nowhere to stop and eat. And we were north of the fashion line, so we figured we better just take whatever we can find. And ultimately, we found this truck stop. Now, when I say truck stop, I don't want you to think about a Pilot station or a Love's station, one of these really nice truck stops they have now. This is kind of a hole-in-wall, barely falling down. There's a couple of trucks there, but maybe they haven't been running for years. But they had a diner, and so we said, let's stop. I think they had chicken nuggets for the kids, so we were all good. And I don't know what Mary Ann had, but as I was looking at the menu, I saw Salisbury steak. Now, you have to understand, I grew up in a house and we didn't have a lot. And so we had, every so often when things were good and we had a little extra money, we would have TV dinners. And when I got a TV dinner, I would always get the Salisbury steak TV dinners. That's all I knew about Salisbury steak. That was what I thought Salisbury steak was, so I ordered it. We play this game in our house sometimes. It always happens in restaurants. I'll order something, and Mary Ann will say, "Is that a good idea?" And normally my response is, "Oh yeah, I'll be fine." And we played that game that night. I ordered the Salisbury steak, and Mary Ann said, "Is that a good idea?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'll be fine." You guys know where I'm going, don't you? So about a half hour down the road, I regretted that decision. And I won't give you all of the details of the story, but it ends with me lying on the floor in the bathroom at camp, having knelt to the porcelain goddess for most of the night. I wished I had listened to my wife, because almost always when she says, "Is that a good idea?" she's right. And almost always I should say, "You know what, you're right, I'll order something else." And every time I don't, I regret it. Now, I know that you probably have some regrets too. And they're probably not regrets like I shouldn't have ordered the Salisbury steak, but maybe you have bigger regrets in life. Maybe you look back on the course of where you've been, what you've done, things you saw, things you haven't seen, and you have regrets. And maybe it's the kind of regret that you revisit over and over and over again. And what you've discovered is no matter how often you revisit those regrets, they don't change. You still don't say what you wish you had said, or you still do say what you wish you hadn't said, or you don't make the decision you think you should have made, and you look back and say, "Man, how different would my life be today if I had done that differently?" You know, the problem with regrets is they paralyze us. They keep us from moving forward. You see, too often regrets of the past infect us in the present and impede us for the future. There's a guy in the Bible that I think had regrets maybe on a larger scale than most of us could even comprehend. His name was Peter. And if you've been coming to the gathering for the past couple months, we've been working our way through the Gospel of John, and we're nearing the end of it. And near the end is where we get to the story of Jesus' crucifixion. But on the night before he died, he was in the garden. And he's there with all of his friends and his disciples. And the soldiers and the temple guard, they come and they arrest him. And Peter tries to fight them off, right? He pulls out his sword and he swings his sword at one of the guards. But Peter's a fisherman, not a fighter. And he swings his sword and he kind of misses and just lops the guy's ear off. Jesus says, "No, Peter, this isn't the time. This is what's supposed to happen." And he heals the guy's ear, and they take Jesus away. And now Jesus is standing trial before the religious leaders, and Peter's out in the courtyard trying to warm himself around a fire, and one of the servant girls, probably like a junior high girl, says to Peter, "Hey, weren't you with Jesus?" And in this moment, something happens to Peter, right? No longer is he the guy that swings his sword wildly to protect Jesus, but he's afraid. He sees what's happening to Jesus, and he realizes this isn't going to end well. And if it doesn't end well for him, it's not going to end well for his followers. And so Peter says, "No, I wasn't with Jesus." And in that moment, I'm certain that Peter had a memory, because it hadn't been that long ago. He'd been talking to Jesus and being brave and courageous, and Jesus said, "Peter, I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter said, "No, Lord, I would never do that." And yet here he is denying Jesus to a servant girl. And probably in Peter's mind in this moment, he says, "I can't believe I did that, but I won't do it again. Next time I'm going to get this right." And then the next time comes, he's standing around the fire and he's warming himself, and someone looks at him and says, Hey, aren't you part of that group that was with Jesus?" And again, Peter says, "No, not me. You got me confused with someone else." And immediately he realizes, that's twice. I can't believe I've done this. I certainly will not do it again. But look what John tells us happens. This is John chapter 18, verse 26. Now, Peter's already denied Jesus twice, and it says this: "One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off." So you see this? So when somebody cuts your cousin's ear off in front of you, you remember it, right? And here's this guy. He's looking at Peter. He's like, "I was in the garden. You're the dude that cut my cousin's ear off. I remember you." He says, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter, again, denied it. And at once, just as Jesus had said, a rooster crowed. If the story ends here, it's a really bad story, right? So if the story ends here, we ask ourselves, why did John even write this? Why would Matthew or Mark or Luke write these stories about Jesus? What's the point in writing a story about a really good guy who's a wise teacher, who everybody loves? He amazingly heals some people, but then he gets arrested and he gets convicted and he gets tried and executed, and that's the end of the story. That's not a very good story, is it? But you see, the reason these guys wrote these stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the reason we still have these stories 2,000 years later is because that's not where the story ended. If the story had ended here, can you imagine the life of regret that Peter would live? For the rest of his life, every morning when the rooster crowed, he would remember what he had done. He would remember that he had disowned his best friend, the man he admired and respected the most. You see, if the story ends here, Peter is an absolute and utter failure for the rest of his life. But if the story ends here, Peter's not the only failure. If the story ends here, Jesus is a failure. Remember when Peter and Jesus first met? Jesus comes up to Peter and he says, "Hey, your name is Simon." That was his name. You're a kind of a fisherman, but I'm telling you, from now on, you will be named Cephas. That's what we call Peter, which means the rock. Jesus is saying something about who Peter was going to be. Hey, Peter, yeah, right now you're just a fisherman, but once you spend some time with me, you are going to be like a rock. And in the garden, when Peter's swinging his sword wildly, he is like the rock. But in the courtyard around the fire, Peter is anything but the rock. And if the story ends here, then Jesus was wrong about Peter. But the story doesn't end here. Fast forward. Jesus goes on trial. He's unjustly condemned. He's sentenced to execution. He's forced to carry his cross through the streets of Jerusalem to a place called Golgotha, the skull. And there the Roman soldiers put nails in his hands and his feet, and they hang him on the cross where he will be for 6 painful hours. Every breath is a struggle because when you're being crucified, you have to pull yourself up just to get a breath. And then you sink back down where you struggle to breathe until you have enough energy to pull yourself up again. And for 6 hours, Jesus endures this agony. But in spite of all the bad that's happening to him, the soldiers are mocking him. They're selling his clothes. The crowd is chanting at him. He still finds it within himself to love and care for the people closest to him. He looks down at John and Mary. By the way, Peter's not here. He's drowning in regret. He looks down at John and Mary and he says, "Son, this is your mother. Mother, this is your son." In other words, you two take care of each other now. And despite the agony and the pain that he's enduring, he somehow finds it in himself to say those incredible words, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And then around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus is finished. And he yields his life back to his Father, and he dies. Some of his wealthier followers go to Pilate and get permission to take his body down from the cross. And they bring it to a borrowed tomb, and they put him in the cold, dark tomb, and they cover the entrance with a large stone. And some of Jesus' friends agree to come back on Sunday. And on Sunday, they'll properly anoint the body and embalm it because the Sabbath is upon them, and no one works on the Sabbath, and you certainly can't touch a dead body on the Sabbath. Meanwhile, the religious leaders, the ones who convicted him and had him killed, they're nervous. They're afraid the disciples are going to steal the body, so they also go to Pilate and say, "Hey, we need help here. We need a Roman guard to watch over the tomb." And so the tomb is sealed with the Roman seal, and a group of Roman soldiers, maybe as many as 50, stand outside the tomb to ensure that the body will not disappear. And the sun sets, and the Sabbath begins. And Jesus' friends, and Jesus' family, and Jesus' followers mourn. Can you imagine the darkness of that Friday night? Can you imagine that Saturday, the emptiness of knowing that everything you had believed in, everything that you thought was true, was done and gone? And at the end of Saturday, the sun went down again in another long, dark night, full of tears, full of sorrow, until Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, everything changed. Because on Sunday morning, the body disappeared. And this matters. Because remember, there's Roman soldiers guarding that body. And some have said, well, certainly it was the disciples. They came and they stole the body and made up this story about resurrection. That's ridiculous. Do you remember Peter in the garden? He's the only disciple that even had a sword, and he didn't know how to use it. And we're expected to believe that these 11 guys came in and took on a group of Roman soldiers, the most well-trained army in the world at that time, and somehow overpowered them so they could steal the body. Do you know what would happen in Jerusalem if a group of Jewish zealots attacked a group of Roman soldiers and killed them? They would have burned the city to the ground because that's how Rome dealt with insurrection. The disciples did not steal the body. And the religious leaders didn't have it. You understand that when the disciples a few days later started talking about resurrection and the rumors started to go throughout the city of Jerusalem that Jesus is alive, Jesus has resurrected. The only thing that needed to be done to prove that it was a lie was to produce the body. If they had simply produced the body, they could have said, look, he's still dead. Why did the Jewish leaders never produce the body? Because they didn't have it. Why did the Romans never produce the body? Because they didn't have it. You see, the body has disappeared, and this does change everything. The women are going up to the tomb on Sunday morning thinking they're going to get Jesus ready for his final burial. And they get to the garden where the tomb is, and the soldiers are gone. And the stone has been rolled away, and they go into the tomb, and there's no body, but there's an angel there. And the angel says, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Now go and tell his disciples and Peter. How great is that? Go and tell his disciples and Peter. Because you see, Peter's story didn't end with his biggest mistake. Peter's story didn't end with a life of regret. Peter's story didn't end with guilt and shame that would chain him down forever. Peter's story didn't end when the rooster crowed. Not even close. So Jesus is risen. And the disciples obey. They go to Galilee where they're told to wait for Jesus. And in Galilee, they do what they know how to do. They go fishing, and they're out fishing one morning, and they look to shore, and they see a familiar figure, and John says, it's Jesus. And Peter can't wait to get to shore, so he jumps out of the boat and swims to shore. And when they all get there, they discover that Jesus has prepared breakfast. He has a fire going, and he's grilling fish for them. And they sit together and they eat with Jesus. And can you imagine how amazing that was? To talk with Jesus, to laugh with Jesus, to learn from Jesus. And when breakfast is done, Jesus maybe gets up and he walks around the fire to Peter and he says, Peter, let's go talk. So they make their way off where they can have some privacy. And I want you to hear the conversation that Jesus has with Peter. This is John 21, verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. You know, there's a lot of things that Jesus could have said to Peter. Maybe a lot of things we expect Jesus to say to Peter. Jesus could have said, Peter, why did you deny me? What were you thinking? He could have said to him, Peter, I told you this was going to happen. Why didn't you listen to me? He could have been mad. He could have been angry. He could have been passive-aggressive and kind of given him the cold shoulder. But Jesus didn't do any of that because Jesus forgave Peter. You see, certainly Peter had caused Jesus pain. And we would look at that pain that Peter caused to Jesus, and in our humanity, we would say, yeah, Jesus probably is justified if he wants to give a little bit of pain back to Peter. Right? Isn't that what most of us would do? When someone hurts us, we want to hurt them. We want them to know what it feels like. We want them to experience the pain that we have experienced. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus forgives. Tim Keller, he's a pastor in New York City. He has a wonderful quote about what forgiveness is. He says, the essence of forgiveness is absorbing pain instead of giving it. You see, if I forgive someone, it means I don't give them back the pain that they've given to me. It means I don't give them back the pain that maybe they deserve. Instead, I choose to carry that pain for myself for their good. And this is exactly what Jesus does for us. You see, on the cross, Jesus was God, absorbing the pain of our sins and turning aside the wrath that we deserve. And this is what Jesus did for Peter. And so I think it's great that 3 times Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? So that 3 times Peter can experience the forgiveness of Jesus. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know that I love you. You see, for all who will accept it, Jesus offers forgiveness, not just once, not just twice, not even 3 times, but eternally and forever. And for everything, Jesus offers forgiveness. But it's bigger than that. It's more than that. Look at the verse again and see the conversation that Jesus has with Peter. Not only does Jesus say, Peter, do you love me? And give Peter the chance to accept that forgiveness and experience that forgiveness, but then he gives him a new mission. Like, we wouldn't be surprised if Jesus had said, Peter, I'm glad you love me, but man, you blew it and I can't trust you anymore. Peter, I'm glad you love me and I forgive you, but hey, there's really not room for you in this group anymore. You really kind of lost your place. Peter, I just don't think we're going to be able to get past that. That's not what Jesus says. He says, Peter, I've got something for you to do. I've got a new mission for you. This is redemption. Because what Jesus offers us on the cross and what Jesus offers us in the resurrection is forgiveness and redemption. There's this word that we don't use anymore. It comes out of Old English. Maybe if I use it in terms you'll understand. Remember King Arthur? So imagine that I come up to Ken and say, Ken, I hereby deem thee Sir Ken the Courageous. Does that make sense? That word deem is not a word we use anymore, but I deem thee Sir Ken the Courageous. Or maybe if Ken's actually not courageous, maybe he's kind of a bad guy, I might say, I hereby deem thee Ken the Scallywag. Right? It's giving a name. To deem something is to describe it, or to declare, or to define what is true about something or someone. Put this into the Peter story. The first time Jesus and Peter met, remember? Jesus comes up to Peter and says, Peter, right now you're known as Simon the fisherman. But I hereby deem thee the Rock. He's given Peter a new identity, a new purpose, a new reason for living. But Peter doesn't always live up to that new name, does he? And so in the courtyard, after Peter denies Jesus 3 times, we certainly can't call him Peter the Rock. We might say, Peter, I hereby deem thee Peter the Coward. And that was deserved. And it's appropriate. But what Jesus is doing here at the fire with Peter is he's offering his forgiveness and he's given him a new identity. What's he doing? He's redeeming him. He's renaming him. He's re-describing him. He's re-declaring what Peter can be if he's willing to let go of his regrets. And do you understand, this is God's big story of creation too. Go back to the very beginning when God makes the world and he makes people and he looks at everything he's created and he says, I deem this very good. We are very good. But then Adam and Eve decide to do things their way, and we all decide to do things our way. And as a result, evil enters the world, and wickedness and sin and broken and everything bad, and no longer can we look at our world and deem it good, can we? And no longer can we look at ourselves and deem ourselves good because we know we're not. And so now we can say maybe we're fallen or we're broken or we're sinful, and that's all true. But at the cross, Jesus redeems creation. He renames creation. He redescribes creation, and he takes us back to the beginning when God now looks at us through Jesus on the cross and says, "You are very good." You see, when you're willing to give your life to Jesus, when you can put yourself into his hands and choose to follow him for the rest of your life, he redeems you. And whatever it is you've been called in your past, and whatever it is that you've called yourself in your past, that's nailed to the cross, and it's buried in the tomb, and a new you has resurrected with Jesus. You have been redeemed. Do you believe this? When you've been redeemed, you can let go of the past. Those regrets that you carry with you, you don't have to hold on to them. That guilt and that shame that binds you and drags you down, it doesn't have to have power over you because you have a new name. You've been redescribed, you've been redeclared, you've been redeemed by Jesus. And the redeemed release their regrets. This whole conversation that Jesus is having with Peter is about teaching Peter it's time to let go of the past, it's time to let go of the guilt, it's time to let go of the shame, it's time to release the regrets and move forward into this amazing future that I have planned for you. Do you believe that this is true for you? You know, as Jesus was dying on the cross, there was a Roman soldier. He was the leader of all of the soldiers that day. So he had seen everything. He'd seen Jesus carry the cross to the mountain. He had seen the nails go into his hands and his feet. He had heard the people talk awfully about Jesus, and he had heard Jesus say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And as this soldier watched Jesus breathe his last, he said, loudly enough for John to hear, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Now, my guess is that before that moment, this soldier had never contemplated anything about Jesus. Before that moment, who Jesus was or what Jesus said or what Jesus had done meant nothing to him. Before that moment, he didn't care a thing about Jesus. I guarantee he didn't wake up that morning thinking, my life is going to change forever today. And then he met Jesus, and his life changed forever. And maybe this morning you're like that soldier. Maybe for most of your life, you haven't cared one bit about Jesus. And maybe you don't really care who Jesus was or what Jesus said or what Jesus did. That's never mattered to you. And maybe you woke up this morning and had no idea that your life could change forever. And you're here because, hey, it's Easter, and somebody invited you and you wanted to go with a friend. But you're listening right now, and you're hearing about Jesus, and something's going on inside of you, and you're not 100% sure what it is, but you've got this feeling in your heart that maybe there's some truth to all of this. Maybe Jesus is the answer I've been looking for. Maybe this is the time I can shed my guilt and my shame, and I can break free of those regrets. And you, just like that Roman soldier, can give your life to Jesus today. There's no magic words. There's no super secret ceremony that you have to go through. It's as simple as just like the soldier saying, this man is the Son of God. Just right there, right now, in this moment, saying to God, I'm giving myself over to you. What I've tried in the past hasn't worked. I'm giving you my guilt. I'm giving you my shame. I'm giving you my sin. I'm giving you my wickedness. Everything I've ever done, I'm turning it over to you. It's yours today, and moving forward, I follow you. Maybe some of you, though, are like Peter. You know, Peter, from the very moment he met Jesus, he believed. And he followed Jesus. And he gave Jesus his everything. But then something happened. Something happened that changed in Peter. And Peter stopped believing. And maybe that's you today. Maybe there was a time in your life, and you look back and you say, yeah, I believed and I followed, but something happened. And maybe it was a hurt or a pain or a broken relationship. Maybe somebody else did something or said something. Maybe life took an unexpected twist. Maybe you just got too busy, or like Peter, you were afraid, but you came this morning thinking, I need to go to church because I ought to go to church, but I'm not sure I believe anymore. But you're hearing about Peter, and you're hearing about redemption, and you're hearing about forgiveness, and you're saying, I need to believe again. It's time for me to believe again. Will you do that? You see, Jesus pulled Peter aside because he wanted Peter to understand that the reason he died was for forgiveness. The reason he rose again was for redemption. And he wanted to recommission Peter to let go of the past and embrace the freedom of the future, the freedom of grace, the freedom that he had for him. And so he commissioned Peter into this whole new life. Jesus went to the cross for you. And Jesus rose from the tomb for you so that he could commission you into a whole new life. A life without guilt, a life without shame, a life without regrets, if you'll give yourself over to him. If you'll put your life in his hands, then you can live the life he has called you to live. None of us can do this on our own. But the resurrection means anything is possible. And the resurrection means we do it through his power. The same power that brought Jesus back from the dead can resurrect you. So I want you to live this week and beyond in the power of the resurrection. I want you to be commissioned to live out the power of the resurrection. I want you to be overwhelmed by the power of the resurrection. I want you to be empowered by the power of the resurrection. I want you to embrace Jesus' forgiveness. I want you to embrace his redemption. And I want you to go out and live for him. Let's pray. Father, what a day this is when we remember what you did 2,000 years ago. And I pray that the same power that you used to bring your son back to life, you will use today to bring back to life what has died in this room. Pray for those who believed once but haven't believed in a long time, that you would fill them with a new sense of belief in you. Father, I pray for those who have never believed, but they're feeling you pull on their heartstrings. I pray that they would be courageous enough to open themselves to you and embark on a brand new journey with you today. Father, help all of us to live our lives this week in your resurrection power. In your name, amen.